Alrighty, we are back, my friends. All prophecy fulfilled, where we have been defining the last days biblically. And man, I got a lot of information for you. So I better just jump right into it. So buckle up. Here we go. Last lesson, we skimmed over the Old Testament, kind of at a 30,000 foot view. We wove together the story of Israel through one thematic lens, their scattering and their gathering. Now, through this one lens, we kind of followed Israel's history and kind of watched it play out through the eyes of 6 different prophets that I kind of picked out from the Old Testament. Now, we clearly saw from those prophets the whole trajectory of the story. We got the house of Israel's dispersion throughout the nations, their disobedience, dispersion. And then later on, we kind of see the house of Judah, kind of the same thing, but always with glimmers of hope, restoration, serving kind of as a remnant. And they really were moving that covenant forward, and they continued on laboring under the law. So that really is or was the story. So we saw how it was foretold. We saw how it began. We saw how it continued all the way down the line to the New Testament, and that's where we arrived. So just like that analogy, got that bottleneck analogy. It's heading that way, and then boom, compression into the bottleneck. Kind of like Jesus said, the law and the prophets were until John. And then what? And then the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is pressing into it. And that right there, that is where we are at. And that, my friends, is Israel's last days. But okay, we basically saw and we focused on the promised bad news basically unfold first. The bad news being Israel's scattering, okay? And I say the promised bad news because the whole thing really was a setup, wasn't it? Well, what do I mean by that? Well, the story was set up. It was foretold in Deuteronomy by the first prophet I spoke of, prophet number 1, Moses, okay? He set Israel on the Torah road under the law to experience the blessings and the curses of the law all the way to their end. And that's exactly where we arrived last lesson, at the end of the story, on the front step of the New Testament. So today, we're going to focus on, and we're going to see the promised good news. Yes, the good news, the gospel, unfold, and that unfolded through Israel's gathering or regathering. So here we are in the New Testament looking at the very final and perverse generation, crooked generation that would come to their end as spoken of by prophet number 1, Moses, okay? And then I moved on to prophet number 2, who was Amos. Now Amos, I don't mean prophet number 2 in their history, just the prophet number 2 that I spoke of last lesson, okay? Amos described Israel and her descendants as going into captivity, dragged into the nations with what? With fish hooks. Remember that? Later on, prophet number 5 that I mentioned, Jeremiah, he described Israel's gathering as a last days fishing expedition. Remember that? Jeremiah 16, behold, I will send for many fishermen, says the Lord, and they shall fish them. Now, the truth is, this fishing expedition was not unique to Jeremiah. Ezekiel speaks of it in Ezekiel 47, but in any case, Jeremiah was specifically talking about scattered Israelites from the house of Israel who would eventually be fished out of the nations that they had been dispersed to, okay? It's almost like, in my view here, how they went into captivity with fish hooks. It's kind of like God said, look, I'm going to pull you out of the covenant, out of the land with fish hooks via a foreign nation, but I'm going to pull you back. I'm going to fish you back. So, that's kind of the way I see it. And then it's funny, we arrive in the New Testament, and here comes Jesus, and he says this to his disciples, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Now, do you think that's coincidence? Or do you think Jesus intentionally drew from Jeremiah and Ezekiel? Well, you better believe he did. Yes, of course he did. I think he was making a clear connection as to exactly who his disciples would be fishing for. They would be fishing for those whom the prophets spoke of, right? The descendants of faith, those out of the scattered tribes of Israel, whose ancestors had once been under the law, under that first covenant. And then we moved on to prophet number 3, who was Hosea. Now, Hosea said this. He said God would actually divorce Israel, the northern kingdom, house of Israel, thus becoming, house of Israel would become not my people. And that's important. And that's exactly what happened. Jeremiah confirmed this fact that God divorced his people. So that really, the house of, that left the house of Judah. So, but those very same not my people, according to Hosea, the cut-off descendants of the house of Israel, those of faith anyway, would once again become his people, the sons of the living God. Okay then, so when, how, and why would this happen? Well, according to Hosea, this would happen like through a new covenant, which really meant B, another marriage would occur. And that meant C, that this marriage covenant was really for the purposes of joining these two houses back together again. You know, really, that's what redemption is. He's bringing back, he's buying back what once was his people. They became not his people, but he's going to bring those people back together again, those two houses back together. This is redemption. That's kind of the story in a nutshell. So this gathering was to be accomplished through a new covenant, a new marriage. Hosea 1:11 said, we covered it, but I'll remind you, the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together. That's in many, many places, actually. Jeremiah 31:31, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Later in Hosea 2, we looked at, and it shall come to be in that day, says the Lord, that you will call me my husband and no longer call me my master. So only through a new covenant could they be gathered. Only through a new covenant could they once again be betrothed to God. Only through a new wedding could the once divorced, not my people, call God their husband. Okay? So here we go. Pay attention here. This is what we need to pay attention to. In Romans chapter 9, 25 through 27 specifically, Paul cites Hosea chapter 1, what I just talked about. Paul cites that. He uses that to show exactly who these Gentiles. Okay, I'm gonna do this every time I say Gentiles. I don't like that word Gentiles. It's not even a word. When we say Gentiles, really we should say or think nations. That's what the word is. Goyim in the Old Testament. It's the nations. And but I don't like that word Gentiles. I'm going to do like a whole separate newsflash on Gentiles. But in any case, I will continue to use Gentiles because you're familiar with it, but I don't like it. I think it's deceptive. Where was I? I'm sorry. Romans 9, 25 through 27. He cites Hosea chapter 1 to show exactly who these Gentiles were who were coming into the covenant in his day. He's answering the question, who are these who have attained the righteousness of faith? That's 9:30. Who's this remnant coming out of this, this vast sand of the sea being saved? That's 9:27. Who are these? Not my people. That's 9:25. Who are these who have been prepared beforehand for glory? That's 9:23. Who are these that God is having mercy on? That's 9:15. Who are these children of promise who are counted as seed? That's 9:8. Who are these of Israel who truly are Israel. That kind of gives it away. That's 9:6. Did you notice that I kind of worked backwards in Romans? I kind of went backwards, and the reason I did that is because we just backed up right into the answer. These Gentiles are the same people in the spotlight throughout the entire story. Since the very beginning, the dispersed of Israel. These are Paul's countrymen according to the flesh who, backing up one more verse into Romans 9:4, are Israelites to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises, of whom are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came. Man, everything Paul discusses about Gentiles is contextually tethered to, bam, Israel's story per the prophets, and it pertains to Israelites to whom pertain, again, the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the law, the services, the promises, etc. And look, if you don't find that very convincing, here's what you need to do. You need to click on any one or every one of those 27 some Old Testament hyperlinks that Paul provides between Romans 9 and 11. So now, when I say hyperlinks, those are Old Testament prophetic citations that we need to click on, which takes us back to the prophets so we can see what Paul's talking about here, because what the prophet is talking about there pertains to exactly what Paul's talking about here. And what we need to do, it will become crystal clear when we do that all these passages in Romans 9 through 11, but right now we're just focusing on 9, are Israel-centric. They're dealing specifically with Israel's scattering and gathering, really, sticking with Romans 9. The referenced Gentiles here are the very ones, and they're the only ones that Hosea was talking about. This is so important. And who was Hosea talking about? Well, he was talking about the cut off Israelites who'd become not my people when they were spread among the nations. So this is the whole reason Paul cites Hosea and the other prophets, to show who's being gathered in here, and that the last day's gathering is coming to fruition in his day. Hosea's story is playing out, and this is going to result in the fullness of the Gentiles coming in before the end, and in this way, Paul said, all Israel will be saved. Okay, so now that at least you see the connection between Paul and Hosea, let's look at it a little bit closer. Most would agree that when Paul begins his letter to the Romans, he basically sees, or he's talking about, two distinct peoples or people groups in view, okay? Now, most people assume, well, okay, yeah, that's the Jews and anybody and everybody else, or that's Israel and anybody and everybody else. No, that's actually not correct, okay? Paul is looking through the lens of the prophets. He knows the story, and he knows to whom the promises pertain to, that I just talked about in 9:4. His message, beginning in chapter 1, in light of the prophet's message, it really only makes sense if the two people are this. Number one, you've got the Jews, you've got the Jews with the law, or the Jews practicing the law, those under law, and you've got the descendants of scattered Israel without the ones. You got the very ones absorbed into the nations. Those are the two groups he's looking at. Paul and his audience knew the story, and they knew who had become not my people. Paul's message wasn't just the message of the prophets, it was the fulfillment of the prophets. So he's wrapping up this story, folks. Okay, there's a huge connection between Paul's letter to Romans and Hosea, and I think one that is largely missed. So pay attention, because I'm going to look at it. I'm going to deal with two very controversial, difficult passages right now: Romans 1 through 3 and Hosea 1 through 4. Now, personally, I think we need to give more credit to Paul's original audiences. Sometimes I think we act like they don't exist or that they wouldn't have known anything. Look, they knew the background and the history. When Paul begins his letters to those in Rome and speaks about people who, although they had knowledge of God, they rejected or they suppressed that knowledge, right? They worshiped idols. They exchanged God's incorruptible glory and their own glory, really, and their privileged status as God's image bearers and God's people, his sheep, his flock. They exchanged that for what? For a corruptible image of birds, beasts, and creeping things of the ground. Well, that sounds familiar. Well, and I'm sure you're familiar with Romans chapter 1. Well, you know what? It was familiar to Paul too, because he got it from somewhere. He didn't just make this stuff up. He didn't pull it out of the hat. Okay? He was talking. Here's the thing we have to kind of take out of our head. We can't assume he was just talking about humanity in general or mankind's sinful proclivities in Romans 1. That's not what he's doing. What he's doing is he's going all the way back to Hosea, to Israel, and how they did this exact thing per Hosea. He is pulling from Hosea 1 through 4, which is all about Israel doing the exact same thing Paul describes in Romans chapter 1. Romans 1 and Hosea 4 are practically parallel passages. That might be kind of an embellishment, but compare the two side by side, you'll see what I mean. Paul is going back to the storyline of Israel being swallowed up by the nations, the birds, not the bees, the beasts, the birds, and the creeping things. And I'm sure you're familiar with Hosea 2:18. Hosea 2:18. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth and make them lie down safely. So, as you probably know, we can find these exact animals. In fact, we can find this same phrase, beasts of the field, birds of the air, creeping things of the ground, in numerous places. And we also know that the animals are often used by the prophets to represent people. So, look, I understand that at first blush, it appears, and I think it's just widely assumed as fact, that these animals in 2:18 are included in this covenant here, along with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And I think the assumption is, and this is kind of how we think, well, oh yeah, okay, so these animals, these are pagans, these are Gentiles, these are, Joe Blow pagans out there, all nations, and really that includes everybody going forward, you, me, everybody. This is the new covenant, this is us. Look, I don't think that's what this is saying. I see a couple different angles here, because really there's kind of two parts to this verse. You got that first part and you got the second part. So, I don't think, this is me here, I don't think it's really possible to fully understand what Paul is saying in Romans 1 through 3 without the contextual backdrop of Hosea 1 through 4, and vice versa. I think Paul's use of Hosea in Romans 1 and 2 helps us better understand Hosea, okay? Like here in verse 2:18. So, Paul draws from Hosea, chapter 4 specifically is what I'm talking about, to explain, listen to this, he's talking about how Israel knew God. How Israel knew God but suppressed that knowledge. They worshipped idols and they exchanged that knowledge for a lie. In chapter 2, Paul makes it clear that both the Jew with the law and the Gentile without the law, they would both perish. The Gentile without the law, but the Jew would be judged by the law. So again, Paul in Romans chapter 1, he mentions these same Gentiles. It's just the connection's right there. And I don't know if you're seeing it. Maybe I'm not explaining it correctly. But in Romans 1, Paul mentions that these Gentiles, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Okay, so they exchanged the truth for a lie. They were worshiping idols. They did not retain God in their knowledge. Look, Paul is simply proving what Hosea said would happen to Israel. And he's saying, look, what would happen to Israel happened. This has happened. Hosea said in chapter 4 that Israel would reject knowledge. They would forget the law of their God. They would play the harlot. They would worship idols. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it would. And that and so we have to ask the question, okay, then what did Hosea said would happen to Israel? What would God do to Israel? Well, listen to this. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 7, he said, I will change their glory, that's Israel, their glory into shame. Now, some manuscripts read my glory, some read they will change their glory, but it says their glory is being changed. Well, Hosea, like I said, he just laid out exactly what Paul confirmed in Romans 1, that the house of Israel exchanged God's incorruptible glory and image along, I think, really with their own glory, and as God's sons, as God's image bearers through that covenant, and they took on the image of the corruptible birds, beasts, and creeping things. Are you seeing it? Now, remember I mentioned Romans 9:5. It says, to the Israelites pertained the glory. Now, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head here. In their disobedience, in their idolatry, and their subsequent scattering, it does seem as though Israel exchanged one glory for another, didn't they? But by rejecting, God, the house of Israel, I think they became every bit the corruptible animals, the beast, the creeping things as their surrounding nations. In fact, they just were assimilated right into them. Okay, also just a thought here. Here's a side note. I'm just stepping back and I'm just trying to use a little common sense, a little reasoning here. If you step back and you think about it, kind of keep that big picture in mind, it actually, for me, it seems to go against the grain of what the prophets explicitly teach elsewhere. That the new covenant would be for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Okay, it would be for them. And I think it seems odd, at least it does to me, that the entirety of chapter 1 and 2, well, the entirety of all of Hosea, to be honest with you, it's all about Israel. It's all about her apostasy, her divorce, her gathering. But right smack in the middle of it, all of a sudden we have this one little verse that says, oh yeah, and by the way, I'm going to invite, or I'm going to include, the rest of humanity throughout all generations into this covenant. The one that I've explicitly said time and time again, probably 4 or 5 passages that explicitly say that the new covenant is for those who were involved with the first covenant, the house of Israel and the house of Judah, okay? But then after that, that's not it, folks. After that, Hosea immediately, he narrows in on Israel again, their betrothal to God, their gathering. So doesn't that strike you just a little bit as contextually odd? Well, it does to me. I just don't think that fits the context of Hosea or the storyline as a whole that the prophets established. So the bottom line here is that Paul was reinforcing, he was demonstrating how God's sheep, upon disobedience, judgment, and scattering, really had exchanged their image, their identity as God's people, God's sheep, for another image, that of the very same birds, beasts, creeping things, and birds in the nations that they'd assimilated to. That's what I'm saying. In other words, they became not my people. Right? That's his point, which was tantamount to being called what we say Gentile, but really nations, which really just meant they were living among the nations, which really in turn was tantamount to being, well, cut off, unclean. They were unclean out in the nations. And speaking of that, here's a couple more points. Something to think about. You probably remember the vision of Peter, Acts 10 and 11, right? Well, what did he see? Well, he's recalling this in Acts 11:6. He says, "When I observed it intently and considered, I saw four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts and creeping things, and birds of the air." So, wow, by golly, there they are again. It's funny when you kind of focus on a phrase or a word, it just kind of keeps popping up, you know. But you might want to take note that when Peter saw this, it was lit down from heaven by four corners. So you got four corners. Now, I think it's interesting that the prophets explicitly say in many places that the houses of Israel and the house of Judah would be gathered from where? Well, from the four corners of the earth. Isaiah 11:12, for example. "I will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah." Yes, some of Judah were dispersed as well. From where? From the four corners of the earth. And there's other verses talking about from the east, from the west, from the north, from the south, and we'll get to those next lessons. So, in addition, Peter makes the objection, if you recall, that these animals were unclean people. Okay, and God says, look, don't call unclean what God has cleansed, or something like that, right? And I think that's important. So these people needed cleansing, just like the idea of being dead in your trespasses was exclusive, or could only be exclusive to those associated with the law, because the law killed. No law, no imputation. If no imputation, no death. That's what the law did. The law killed. I was alive once without the law, but the law entered in and it killed me. Okay? So just as, like the idea of being dead in trespasses, really, that is really for those associated with the law. Well, so too with being cleansed, okay? We need to ask ourselves, what would these animals need cleansing from? Right? And why would God cleanse them? What's the point here? Well, if these folks are the people I think they were, well, I think it's because God promised to cleanse them. Speaking again to Israel, Ezekiel 36:24 and 25. "For I will take you from among the nations, gather you out of all the countries, and bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols." So, the idea of being cleansed, purified, it really is a covenantal idea. I mean, how many references do we see in the New Testament, like to the church and to those entering Christ as being made pure and clean and holy and washed and prepared as a bride for her husband? Well, there's a lot of them. And obviously, I think, cleansing, we know this, it was central to the law, to its rituals, to the system. And a lot of those rituals, they represented cleansing from sin and transgression under the law. And that reminds me of like Hebrews 9:15. Christ is the mediator. Why? Well, for the forgiveness of transgressions made under that first covenant. Okay, again, you have to have a law in a covenant to transgress against in order to need cleansing from. And that's the point. In fact, that was the goal of Daniel's 70 weeks, right? That to finish Israel's transgression, and not just to atone for, but to actually make an end of Israel's sins. Okay, so the cleansing really, in the story, the cleansing is for those under law. That's who needed to be cleansed of their sins. So, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, right? Well, what sin, what world? Well, Israel's imputed sins under law within their covenant world. That's what's in view. So if these animals that Peter saw were being cleansed, I think that meant they needed cleansing from something specific, and I'm guessing its connection to law because they were at least one time connected to that law. So in my opinion, this makes a lot more sense, and I think it's consistent with both the language and the message of the prophet. So the bottom line is, as is commonly assumed, I just don't think that we can conclude that these birds, these beasts, these creeping things are just Joe Blow pagans out there actually entering into the new covenant, because that covenant was specifically for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So Peter was simply seeing what the prophets described. The outcast, the dispersed of Israel and Judah, they were being cleansed from their idolatry, from their sin, from their beastly, idolatrous ways among the nations, and they were re-exchanging, in my opinion, they were re-exchanging that corruptible image that they'd put on for, once again, for the more glorious image of God as they were regathered from the four corners of the earth. So that's one angle of Hosea chapter 2:18. But you know what? There's more than one angle. I think there's different ways you can see it. In fact, I think there's probably different layers to this that you really don't see until you start peeling back. So that's one perspective. Now here's another thought on Hosea 2:18, and I think most people don't consider this and they don't see it, probably because we tend to ignore the second half of Hosea 2:18. So let me explain. Let's focus in on that second half of Hosea 2:18, because it seems to me that this verse is saying that the new covenant would have a positive effect, a peaceful effect on the nations where Israel had been scattered to. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, have you ever noticed in almost all these references to Israel's new covenant and the various animals involved, it's usually followed by something referring to peace, no more war, animals living together, that kind of thing, okay? So again, pay attention to the second part of this verse. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth to make them lie down safely. Okay, couple things. No more war. You got animals dwelling together safely. So, to make them lie down safely, again, that's like thematic in itself. We could take that one little phrase and we could find it all throughout the scripture. It's one of those phrases like, and I will be their God and they will be my people, or and then they will know the Lord. They're kind of everywhere, and they always seem to be tied with this bottleneck time frame where things are coming into the kingdom. And so they seem to be always associated with that new covenant and a result of it. So what does this mean? Well, Israel's new covenant, that would bring an end to the curse. Their curse under the law, which really was a curse to and among the nations. Did you know that? It's true. Israel's plight under the curse had an effect on all the nations. The nations and the people around Israel, they were often likened to like the roaring seas and, with constant turmoil, no peace, usually at odds with Israel, right? Isaiah 17:12, woe to the many nations that rage. They rage like the raging sea. Woe to the peoples who roar. They roar like roaring of great waters. So you see, the division of Israel and her subsequent scattering into the nations, that had ripple effects. Okay, the truth is, Israel didn't simply experience the curse of the law. Israel was a curse to the nations, and she would continue to be so until that curse was lifted, was done away with. Zechariah 8:13, as you have been a curse among the nations, O house of Judah and house of Israel, so I will save you and you will be a blessing. Well, once again, there's a very explicit statement saying that the house of Israel, the house of Judah, they would be saved. And we see those in the New Testament. They would be saved, and then they would be a blessing. Okay, Jeremiah 29:18. I will pursue them with sword, famine, and plague. I will make them a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. a curse, a desolation, and an object of scorn and reproach among all the nations in which I banish them. Man, that's bad news for everybody. Everybody involved, all the nations involved were affected. The story is about the curse of the law that would be done away with eventually. When that happened, there would no longer be a people under the curse or a people scattered to the nations, causing this turmoil, causing this havoc. So as Hosea chapter 2 says, the new covenant, I think, was indeed for them. It was for Israel, for the house of Israel, the house of Judah. But I think we could say it was with the beasts, the creeping things, the birds of the grounds. It had this effect on those around them. It wasn't just a peace, if you want to call it that, between God and Israel coming into covenant. The removal of the curse, I think, would bring a peace that was not previously possible while Israel was under the curse. So if there was no longer a people under the curse of the law, there could no longer be a people scattered in judgment throughout the nations, being a curse to those nations. Does that make sense? I sure hope so. I probably should have skipped all that because I really don't want to end on a weak or a vague point, but I guess I did. So let's recap. Last lesson. We did a flyby of the Old Testament, looking through one thematic lens, Israel's Old Testament scattering, right? And we did so by looking at 6 prophets. Well, today we kind of entered into the New Testament, the last days, the bottleneck, when Jesus said everything was pressing into the kingdom, right? And we moved along and we basically looked at what those prophets said, through the lens of the New Testament writers. Okay, well, today I think we covered 4 of them: Moses, Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah. So next lesson, we're going to finish this up by looking at the last 2, Ezekiel and Isaiah, and how the New Testament writers treat their writings, the ones we looked at last lesson, okay? And I think next lesson, it's going to tie this all together a little bit better than I'm doing here, because we're going to wrap that up, finish out that bottleneck, and then we'll get back into the New Testament and look at all the occurrences, all the ladders and the last and the ends in the New Testament. So, okay, thanks for tuning in. I will see you next round. Appreciate it, folks. See you again. Adios.